At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs.
Well, hello and welcome back to the Drug Science Podcast. This is not the voice that I imagine a lot of you were expecting to hear. My name is James Bunn, and I produce the Drug Science Podcast with Professor David Nutt and do the audio technological wizardry in the background. This is just to let everyone know that this is a slightly different episode to how we've usually done it in the past. Part one of this episode, we are interviewing Evgeny about his upcoming ayahuasca experience in Peru. Now, the audio for that recording has become a little bit corrupted just due to the fact it was recorded with rather patchy internet in South America. So please bear with us in that sense, because part two, we speak to Evgeny again to hear his reflections on his ayahuasca experience. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Dave, but if you want to fast forward to his reflections, you can do so about the 18-19 minute mark or so. So without further ado, let's get on with the show.
Well, hello everyone. This is the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Today we have a rather unusual podcast, and the guest on the podcast today is someone that many of you will have heard of, or have probably not heard speak much before. Evgeny Lebedev, who is, of course, very well known as the owner of The Independent and the Evening Standard newspaper, and who is about to undergo an ayahuasca ceremony in Costa Rica. He approached me a couple of weeks ago asking if I could help him find a suitable place, and I hope I have, because he's there now, and he's just told me he's had a 3-hour introduction, which suggests to me that they've done a pretty thorough job, and I'm delighted that you are prepared and interested in talking about while you're doing it, and eventually, after you've done it, what effect you might have had on you. So, Evgeny, the floor is yours.
David, hello. Thank you for talking to me, and you good voice for this. Could listen to you for hours. I'm sure the listeners are glued to listening to you. But and you very kindly came on a podcast episode that I've done on psychedelics, which I'm yet to release, but it's part of a series it's called Brave New World, and it's part of a series on advances in medicine and healthcare and things like longevity and genetics and psychedelics and their huge benefits of late discovered in treatment of mental health issues is one of them. And so, but my journey here has been partially through talking to you and Professor Robin Cathcart-Harris, who I think is a pupil of yours, but is now gone across the pond, and Amanda Fielding, who's been a great pioneer in this field, and now her theories and her observations are all coming to reality. So that's been one aspect in my decision to come here and do this. I've been interested in healing healers, and so this is the more scientific aspect, which from your colleagues, and only in the last 3-4 years I've really understood quite thoroughly, deeply, how these substances, be it ayahuasca or psilocybin or LSD, could have profound effects in treating mental health issues. But separately from that, I've been interested in plant medicine, and I've actually done ayahuasca once before, about 13 years ago, in a very different way. I was just traveling through Peru with a couple of friends, and we ended up being in Machu Picchu, and I think one of them who just read about it because it was quite a new thing in the West at the time said, should we just do it? And after a little bit of wavering, we all said, let's just do it. So we found some healers in Machu Picchu who drove us up top of a mountain in a wide, beat-up Land Rover. So I wasn't even sure if we'd come back alive, but we did, and it was an interesting experience, if not that profound, because it wasn't as prepared and as thought through as this one is, and so here I am, having traveled just towards this one, a more spiritual one and one a more scientific one, but of course they totally intertwine, because the two things are connected in one way or another, whatever you might believe in or whatever your system of belief is, whether it's purely scientific or beyond. And I felt that now was the right time for me to do this.
I'm sure you're right. I'm sure when the time is right, if you think it's the right time, it is the right time. It's very brave of you. I mean, do you feel brave to be public about this, or do you think it's now sufficiently mainstream that you won't suffer any kind of negative publicity as a result?
Well, we live in Britain, and so that's number one, so I'm sure I'll suffer negative publicity. Number two, to me, so I'm sure I have no doubt. I was just curious to hear from you on how you feel about me speaking about this publicly, and also just generally about ayahuasca, because I believe we didn't speak about it that much on when we spoke. We mostly spoke about psilocybin.
Yes. Well, obviously, as someone who's been campaigning for a long time to have a scientific perspective and scientifically driven drug policies, I'm delighted that someone with your ability to influence public opinion and also just share evidence in through your media outlets is actually prepared to do this. I think this is potentially a groundbreaking event and an experience, and obviously I very much hope that afterwards you get insights which will convince you and others that it was worthwhile and supports what we and many others are trying to do through our research. So, but I was also particularly, I did a little bit of background reading of you, and I discovered that your grandfather was actually a very eminent biologist, and a sort of an evolutionary biologist, and, back in Russia. And so I'm sort of intrigued as to whether you feel you're maybe in his footsteps as well as doing something for yourself.
Undoubtedly. I was very lucky to have had a grandfather like this who basically wished that I was his son, and was very much putting everything into me, going into his footsteps, which sadly now in hindsight, although it's never too late, I realize sadly I didn't, but it has implanted so much in me, the curiosity about science, the curiosity about the natural world, the curiosity about discovery and scientific discovery in particular. So, absolutely. And the first time I actually traveled to South America was with him when I was, I think, 13 years old. We went to Bolivia and Peru. So there's no doubt that it's there. So
part of his legacy is in you. Yes. But of course, the other thing that I want the listeners to know a little bit more about you is your interest in art. And one of the things that permeates the whole of the history of psychedelia, really, is this fabulous relationship with art, going back to certainly to the ancient Greeks, or before the ancient Greeks, to the mushroom men, the great carvings in the walls of cave buildings in Algeria, and also the statues in South America. And you're an art collector and a man who knows a lot about art. And I think if we could pull together some of the insights from art and some of the insights from science, we could actually get, maybe make things more amenable and more understandable to those people who are in either the separate camps. So I'm looking forward to doing that. Well, of course, I mean, that's the most famous book of all in the whole psychedelic the literature is, of course, Doors of Perception.
Yes.
And where does that term come from? That comes from one of Britain's greatest artists, William Blake. And Blake was both a visionary artist, but also a visionary sort of philosopher of mind. And And I think, although I don't think Blake took psychedelics, but he certainly had images that were very compatible with the psychedelic experience and had the insights. And I think many great artists, they kind of don't need psychedelics because their mind works as minds work under psychedelics without them. They're sort of gifted with that those abilities to see things differently, to see the bigger picture. It may be that art is a way of communicating that experience to groups of people who couldn't get it themselves or couldn't understand it themselves. And I was just wanting to reflect on that with you a bit.
Well, Blake is a great example, of course, because he was the ultimate traveler without leaving his home. His imagination, and it's interesting to that he never took psychedelics that we know. But yeah, I mean, as I've already mentioned, I have always been very curious about the connection between science and art. So I'll see I shall keep that in mind and see what comes out on the other side. And have you yourself had experience with ayahuasca?
No, I haven't. We are using DMT quite a lot now.
Yes, of course.
And we're very difficult for us to use ayahuasca in the UK because as scientists we have to be absolutely sure that what we're giving is compliant, and it's I think impossible to. In this country, UK, as you pointed out, has got one or two strange traits, and one of them is that we are very unsympathetic to plant medicine. In fact, we don't have any plant medicines currently available in Britain, with the possible exception of medical cannabis, which is rarely used. So we've been part of a bit like Germany, we've been part of the idea that you've got to extract from the plant a single pure substance, because that's what is the only thing you can be certain about. But in doing so, we may well miss a trick or two.
In an ideal world, what would you something that could be realistic, or what kind of change would you want to see in the UK?
Well, what we're very keen on seeing is alterations in the schedules to make it easy for us to do research with these compounds. I mean, for the last 50 years, the Home Office, the British governments have consistently told us that these drugs are very dangerous, which they're not, are addictive, which they're not. You can use addiction, and have no medical value, which was actually an outrageous lie because they were medicines before they were banned as a result of the Nixon's war on drugs. So we need to completely change the position of these drugs in relation to medicines. And, if that's something that you through your newspapers could help us do, then the millions of people would be grateful. And the millions that would be a miracle.
Yes, well, that's that is my aim, because the whole aim of my podcast was to actually educate people about what is out there in any kind of in any aspects of their body or mind.
Well, we've been part of the first study of DMT in treatment of depression. It was run by a company called Small Pharma Inc., which is one of these startup companies. It's got very excited by our work on treatment-resistant depression. So they did a very nice study, then quite a few members of our team were part of that. And it showed, yes, it's an infusion of DMT, which is equivalent to taking ayahuasca, produced quite profound reductions in depressive symptoms, which were long-lasting. So, I think DMT seems to be probably similarly effective as psilocybin in depression. And the big challenge now for that company is to raise enough money to take it through to the later stages of registration. But as you may know, the psychedelic marketplace is becoming very threatened. There's a bit of a bust. There was a boom a couple of years ago, but we're going down into a bit of a bust at present. And I'm a bit worried that many of the companies that were set up will struggle to make it through.
Why is that? Because of too saturation?
No, I don't entirely know. I think partly it was perhaps overhyped. A lot of money came in from the cannabis bubble. I think a failure to realize that these are different kinds of medicines to traditional medicines. I think also the regulators are saying, well, they are so different, we don't know how to regulate them. You're only maybe taking one dose, but you're also having quite a lot of therapy around it. So there's more uncertainty. It's different. This is a unique kind of medicine where people can be healed or maybe even cured in a very short space of time. And so the current business model for pharma is give something every day for a very long time. And this is exactly the opposite of that.
Well, look, David, I'm grateful again. I've been the reason why I'm here really at this time is because we're not going to have a psychotherapy session, but it's for one reason or another. It's been a tough sort of 18 months, years, and I've realized that I've not become a good partner, a good friend, a good son, a good nothing. It's just kind of never-ending loop of activity that obviously is there to mask something else, something deeper. And the last 2 years have particularly brought this to the surface, and I just felt that I had to break this kind of hamster wheel or Ferris wheel, if you will, which I can never come off of. I just have to keep constantly turning and turning it. So here I am, and once again, thank you for talking to me, and thank you for helping me find this place.
I'm really hoping for you, and I'm really looking forward to you sharing your experiences and your insights subsequently, and then we can talk a bit more then about the science and what may be going on in your brain to affect the changes.
Yeah.
I hope.
Hi there, curious minds and seekers of knowledge. If you're passionate about understanding the science behind drugs or their impact on society, we've got something exciting for you. If you're looking to bridge the gap between cutting-edge research and practical applications, you should find out more about our recently launched consultancy arm of Drug Science. As of 2024, Drug Science has opened up a brand new consultancy service that brings evidence-based solutions to the forefront of drug policy and public health. Whether you are a policymaker, you work in biotech and drug discovery, or you're part of an organisation navigating the complex landscape of drug-related issues, Drug Science Consultancy is here to guide you. Our team of experts combine years of research experience with a commitment to evidence-based decision-making, from scoping the literature to developing clinical trials or providing educational programs. We can tailor our services to meet your unique needs. So don't just stay informed, become a driving force of positive change with Drug Science Consultancy. Visit drugscience.org.uk/consultancy today, or check the show notes for a direct link.
Well, tell us a bit more about it. So you had 1, 2, 3 ceremonies?
It was a grouping of 4 ceremonies over a week. So there were 2, and then a night off, and then another 2. The advice was to sort of build up slowly to the third one, which was the biggest dose taken, and then the sort of reduction on the 4th day. And it's by no means an easy experience. It's for those listeners who think that, and I think there's a lot of misconception about that. You know more than me about psychedelics, particularly when they're discussed in this kind of realm of treatment of the mind. A lot of people think who are not familiar with the subject think it's a bit of a jolly. It's definitely not that. It's a commitment, and it's hard work. And one thing I have learned for sure is that despite the fact that it's hard work at the time, the real hard work starts afterwards, when you start integrating what you've learned and those things that you've intended to find out about. Because if you don't, then it doesn't really work. Well, for me, it didn't really work anyway.
Well, let's come on to that integration in a minute, but let's just tell us a bit more about so you had 4 ayahuasca sessions in group with a shaman.
Yes. So the way it works is it was a rather large group. I'm not very good at speaking to one person about my feelings, let alone a group of 20 or so Americans who tend to be very good at speaking about their emotions and their feelings. And us Russians are totally the opposite. and so even that in itself was an interesting and worthwhile experience for me, to be able to sit around in a group and discuss why I was there, and then discuss what I experienced, and at the end discuss what I've taken out of it.
I suppose that most of them didn't know who you were then, I guess. I guess you're less of a public figure in the US. Would that be fair?
What did you say? You suppose?
most of them would not have known. I mean, I would have thought most English people would know who you were, but I guess in America you're probably not so well known.
Well, I'm not sure even about English, but they do try their utmost to keep people's identity confidential. So they only use first names, but towards the end, I suppose there's more familiarity amongst each other, and so. But yes, it is quite anonymous in that sense, which is a nice thing. Particularly, it was nice in that sense. It was nice, and Americans are, they were pretty much all Americans. I think that there was one person from Serbia and myself. Otherwise, everyone was American, and Americans are much freer and easier just in communicating. So it was just a good experience for me in itself.
Yes, so good role models.
Yeah, in moderation. So to talking about the experiences themselves, it was in a large space called the Maloka, which is a traditional healer structure made of wood and thatch, and a ceremony took place in the round, and after dark there was a yoga session, and then the healers or the shamans and the so-called facilitators, who are the people who look after any needs of the patients or the guests, come in, and there's a moment's or a half an hour silence and contemplation, and then in turn everyone takes the ayahuasca, and then everyone goes into their own space. People are encouraged not to communicate between themselves, or in quite the opposite, they're asked not to. And so the first experience for me was very light, and then in the second one I did experience something really interesting, which was taking me back to my childhood, or rather baby time surgery that I had on my intestines. I had the intestinal dissection when I was 4 months old. I saw a theater and surgical theater with a surgeon in a white mask and very kind of austere Soviet-style surgical theater, bright lights, and a surgeon in a white mask and a white cap and one of those old school mirrors on the forehead leaning over me. So that was really interesting because I didn't really, I obviously very well aware I have a huge scar on my stomach, but it's not really something I thought much about. But that was an interesting place to be taken to, and I guess has affected me in so many ways, because at that time, to be, even though not necessarily consciously, but definitely subconsciously or somewhere deep down consciously, being aware of fear and worry and loss of control, and
death, I suppose, as well. I mean, presumably it was life-threatening. It must.
Yes, absolutely. And not being able to, or my mother not being able to have access to me for at least 4 days at all, and then some weeks afterwards only in the daytime. So, and I have a child, and I can see that she's not, when she was very little, if she didn't have her mother around, then it would be very, very distressing, even for an hour or two, let alone a few days. So that was very interesting and definitely unexpected.
Yeah, I guess you hadn't thought about that for many years, I suppose. I mean, had you ever reflected on it before?
Not really. The only thing I reflected on is that I have a very big, hard scar, so I thought maybe they forgot to take the stitching out. That's the only thing that's ever crossed my mind. But I've never actually thought about it. I did ask my mother very recently since, just to find out, and I got this detail from her. and which I just wasn't very familiar with. So I think this is, you'd be better placed to talk about this, but I think this is one of the things that psychedelics do, is they take you back to root causes of certain feelings, emotions, and mental conditions that you might experience as a result of what's happened to you very early.
Indeed, they do. And psychedelics do uncover memories which have long been forgotten. But have they been? They've obviously not been forgotten because they're still there. And one of the interesting questions that we're wrestling with from the perspective of the science, the neuroscience of psychedelics, is what is the nature of that sort of pseudo-forgetting? And my suspicion is that your brain and our brains actively repress. They try to stop you accessing things which are challenging, difficult, painful, which you can't process. So what's the point in going back there? But that repression is effortful. And one of the theories we're working on in relation to depression is that the mental effort, the mental exhaustion of depression is often driven by brain having to use so much effort to stop you accessing the root cause.
Yes. I suppose it's similar to the way humans and humanity tends to be quite forgetful about all the pain and suffering of the generations, and quite easily.
Well, yes. I mean, it's obviously hugely adaptive. I mean, if you can't stop thinking things which you can't deal with, then that will also disrupt your functioning. So it's a question, again, of the balance right. And obviously, what one tries to do in psychedelic therapy is to deal with the access. It's when, in your case, understanding or getting experience, it was probably would have been extremely traumatic and may have patterned some of your lifelong mental behaviors, but allow you now to potentially deal with it as a result of understanding the importance of it and recollecting it. So, but maybe we'll come back to that in terms of the integration. Tell us a little bit more about the other two trips, please.
So on one of the nights, I had an interesting journey back to, I guess, ancestral trauma or ancestral epigenetic mark from a fear of, just a general downright fear of, was very present in the consciousness and minds of Soviet citizens throughout the 30s, 40s, early 50s, in kind of height of Joseph Stalin's rule. And most members of my ancestry lived in Moscow at the time, so that would have been the main target of this purging and disappearance of individuals for any number of reasons, from saying the wrong thing to literally just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a neighbor wanting to move in on your space and in a communal apartment, or if it was discovered that you had ancestry that was, God forbid, aristocratic, but could be clerical, or even to do with Russian imperial bureaucracy, army. So a lot of people lived in fear, and I think I had this vision of a communal apartment and washing lines going through the corridor, and sort of pots on the stove, and in that kind of 1930s way, kitchen fire burning stoves, and just this strong presence of fear.
Yeah, well, that permeated society, didn't it? Bizarrely, I've just recently read Julian Barnes's book about Shostakovich. I don't know if you've read it, The Silence of Time, about how he lived so much of his life anticipating disappearing. He managed to function, but it was a hugely distressing period. Every night he'd stand outside his apartment expecting to be taken away, and he didn't want his wife and children disturbed by it, and he'd sit waiting for the police to come. Luckily, they never did. It's a remarkable book if you've not read it. I mean, it would just reconjure up some of those, perhaps too many of those memories that you forgot. But they must, as you say, they must be deeply embedded in the Russian psyche.
Yes, for sure. Well, it might be helpful if you can explain to the listeners a little bit more about this, because it's of course very much a healer, ancient shamanic tradition of ancestral wounds, ancestral trauma. But as far as I understand, and you'll know more about this than I do, but the recent research has shown that you can pass on such things through epigenetic.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it seems like periods of extreme stress, and most of the work has been done relating to starvation stress or malnutrition, that can change the germline so that particular traits are amplified or more prevalent in other generations, because there's been an indelible impact on your genetics through those traumatic experiences. I mean, they're less easy to study. There's less good data with psychological trauma, but I don't see any reason why that shouldn't happen.
Yes, and I just know, for example, that in my father's mother's family, her father was very lucky to escape disappearance, and him and his whole family, because his sister worked as a secretary to the police chief who was in charge of dishing out orders on arrest. And she saw her brother's name and told him that he and his family will be arrested. So he packed up his bags and everything they could take, and they just left their house. And presumably somebody else was arrested, because the way it was done on quotas. It sounds terrifying now. It's so hard to actually get your head around. But if you've read this book, and then you can sort of get into the mindset of what it was like living there. But it must have been utterly terrifying, where this sort of people were just quotas, and they had quotas. You had to arrest this many people in order to sort of keep the fear very much present in people's minds.
That was the point, wasn't it? To keep the fear, so that you were too terrified even to protest or even consider organizing some kind of resistance.
Yeah, and certainly was there.
It's interesting. I mean, one of the things I've always been intrigued by and haven't really ever properly got my head around was this idea that psychedelics help you get to access to sort of archetypes. I don't know if you know that the man who founded Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson, actually escaped from his alcoholism through a psychedelic trip. And he then, when LSD became available, he's actually, Huxley's first exposure to LSD was with Bill Wilson. And Wilson strongly supported research on using LSD to help people overcome alcoholism. But he was also very interested in the psychological experiences, and he wrote some rather sort of famous letters to Carl Jung, saying that Jung should consider psychedelics rather than dream analysis as a way of really accessing these archetypal people, figures, contents of dreams, which underpin a lot of human experience and narratives and these sort of historical perspectives. Unfortunately, Jung was very old and was dying at the time. He didn't really take him seriously, but I think what you're describing fits quite well with what Wilson and others would see as being allowed to see back through generations. So it's not uncommon for people to get that experience.
So what do you mean by how would that translate into? What made you think of that in relation to what I've said?
Well, it's the presence of generational traits is very similar to the sort of presence of these Jungian archetypes. So there are features in dreams which are very common. Features like being chased, features like being things like goblins and elves, unpleasant creatures, scary things. There are certain features which are common certainly in many nightmares, and Jung would saw them as some kind of collective archetype, that there were features of humanity which were embedded in the brain, which came from you don't taught them. No one's taught to have nightmares. They're just there, and when you have, they express themselves in periods of, episodes of anxiety like a nightmare. And why they should be so similar is unknown. Actually, I mean, one of the things that's becoming interesting now and a little bit touched on in our work to some extent, hard to study, are the entities. I mean, again, the experience of entities, which some people have with some psychedelics, of the sense of other beings, is kind of not dissimilar to those sorts of dream-related experiences as well.
It's an extraordinary thing. I having first learned about this, just brushing with it in Peru 13 years ago, then exploring the field of psychedelics and the development of this field, a recent resurgence of treating mental health and talking to yourself and Robin and then doing it myself it's been a really, really interesting and enlightening journey in so many ways, because it is, for me anyway, it's what you do find so many things about yourself that I'm just not sure you can through.
I'm sure you can't, which is why I've invested the last 20 years of my life in this research, because I think it does open up doors and avenues and understandings that you can't get in any other way, really. So tell us about the fourth one then. So you had, is there any unity between them, or was each one completely different?
Well, I think probably the unity between them somewhat, and unity in my head was all about, this idea of control and needing to be in control and trying to figure out where that came from and losing control, really. And, I've probably quite irresponsibly, I set myself an intention to be out of control. And only now in hindsight, I realize what tough task that is, to set my mind with the aid of psychedelics to lose control. And that I certainly did. And that was, it was a very, very tough experience. It was, lots of black voids and lots of falling, lots of trying to grab onto things, to hold on to things and to be able to be in control, but not being able to be in control. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, if not the hardest.
But you survived?
Yes, I've survived, and as I've said before, it was very, very tough. But I don't regret it for a moment, because I have learned a hell of a lot, and I've also learned that it's okay to be not always in control.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there are many mental disorders which exist because of people's desperate attempts to maintain control in situations which are very difficult, and in the end, that attempt ends up dominating the lives to a point where the lives are actually really quite diminished. So, conditions like depression, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, anorexia, they're about trying to maximize control where in many cases you don't need to, but they become habitual and destructive in themselves.
Well, it is also interesting for me, and I've been just thinking about this recently, and I had a very interesting conversation with Dr. Gabor Mate, who you very kindly put me in touch with, and it was interesting to think about the things that we consider as conditions, and they get diagnosed, to actually look at them in a different way, because some of them clearly are conditions, but some of them are just being conditioned by certain things that have happened earlier on in life, be it ADHD or be it OCD, and these, if you can find out what it was sometime that has led you to behave this way, I think it's, I don't know if you agree with this, but it seems to me that it's much easier to accept, perhaps, living with that.
Oh, I'm coming to terms with, yes. Obviously I've come from exactly the opposite pole of psychiatry, the very biological pole than Gabor. But the more we, and again, it's psychedelics that have done this, the more we understand the way psychedelics uncover early trauma, the more we realize that we've got a lot more work to do, but dealing with those memories, dealing with those experiences. In the past, what we have done, in psychiatry is kind of said, well, it's too difficult, so let's just paper over the cracks. Let's give people antidepressants or antipsychotics to try to stop those memories disturbing people so much. Now we're, I think, in a situation where we might be able to get them into a state where we can potentially change, as you say, your attitude to them. So things like mindfulness, maybe come to terms with them and actually not have them as a problem, have them as a fact, but not have the emotion that's distorting the way you live your life. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I remember when we spoke back in August, and we talked about that great metaphor. And I think then you used the Buddha version of it, of the burrows or the ski burrows of your mind, and you just keep going down the same way day after day after day. And it is definitely the case that what psychedelics do is they just give you an opportunity to find new paths, new ways to go. Having had new snowfall, you can choose which way to go. But of course, when you do come back to your everyday life, in the end, your external and your internal, or there's the sort of the big. I think the terminology is base prize, right? And they haven't gone away anywhere. So it's about trying to integrate what you've learned within your external circumstance that you've come back to exactly the same as it was, and also your internal programmed, the so-called base prize that are still there and haven't gone anywhere.
Yeah, but of course, one of the points I make to people about psychedelic experience is it might not cure you, but it does show you can change. The experience itself is changing.
Absolutely. Yes, that's what I mean. It's all there still, but you just have to really work hard at what you've learned, bringing that into your old life.
So tell me what you've been doing since you got back then. How have you been working with those insights and experiences?
Well, I've tried to be there in Costa Rica for a bit of time and not come back to, which I did. So I really intended to do that, and I was very lucky, and I was grateful that I've been able to do that, because it was very, very important not to just come back to your old life and not to be surrounded by lots of people and not to go through a busy airport. So that was really important. And then just talking to people, like yourself, like Michelle, who you've introduced me to, people who understand how it works and help to bring the learnings of the psychedelic experiences into real life. I know I'm repeating myself now probably for the third time, but it is really important to just continue working at it, because it just does not. Because I do hear people say a lot to me, I think it's all worn off, all the effects are worn off, and there's nothing lasting. But I do believe very strongly, because I have done this once before many years ago, and I can't say it's had any long-lasting effect at all. But of course, I didn't. It came and went, and that was it. Whereas this time, I've made a real effort to try and bring this into.
Excellent. Yes, and I think it's the nature of life, isn't it? It's very rare that anyone solves the problem of life in one go. It's a marathon experience, isn't it? Not a sprint, and you gradually acquire some kind of command and control over these negative priors, and also I presume and I hope that you begin to develop relationships or reform relationships that are going to be healthier and less destructive based on those insights.
Yes, absolutely. And would I do it again? Yes. I know people who really on the path of sort of self-learning and do it time and again, and but one step at a time. But I definitely do it again. And as you said, part of what you just said, I feel that it would be hugely beneficial to continue.
And what would you say to other people? Presumably, you're going to meet people who will ask you, should they do it? How do you deal with that?
I would say that it's something one has to be really ready for and has to really be open to. You have to go in there with an open mind and an open heart. There's no other way of saying this, and because otherwise it just won't work, I think. But if you have decided on this is the right path for you, I think it is an extraordinary a way forward that would, in my view, allow you to leapfrog, decades of psychotherapy. And if it is integrated with possibly psychotherapy or mindfulness or everything, you could, and I'm saying this obviously not with deep scientific or medical knowledge, just from what I've been able to gauge and learn in speaking to some learned, extraordinary individuals like yourself and Gabor, and then reading and also experiencing myself. It's a very, very powerful tool.
Well, Evgeny, your story is very compelling, and I want to say again, I really thank you for your courage in sharing it with us. I think it's going to give a lot of people a lot of time for thought, and then let's hope it can help break some of the fear and the hostility and the negativity that a lot of people still have to the idea that psychedelics can be healing. I'd love to stay in touch with you. I think if things change over time and you get new insights, to get back in touch. We can always have part C of the podcast, but in the near future, we're going to publish or send out the A and B, and I will let you know when that happens. And thanks again for sharing with us.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I do hope, as you say, it will shed some light on this field and these experiences for listeners, because they've been truly life-changing for me. So it's been I was very happy to talk to you about this. Thank you for having me back.